Hello and welcome to the second bootcamp in this series. And today we're going to talk about stories. Now, I hope before we progress that you've actually done the work on the happiness book and that you've actually listened to the audio CD and understood the nature of the see, hear, feel, think technique in terms of reaccessing experiences. And if you've done that, then that's fantastic, and we can progress to stories. As we saw in the book and in the television program, we are surrounded by stories. We're surrounded by the stories other people tell us, we're surrounded by the stories that we tell ourselves, and we're surrounded by the agreements that we've made with other people. And those agreements are about how to behave. We may like to think about it, but we are conditioned socially, we are conditioned spiritually or religiously in some cases. We're certainly conditioned by our parents. Now, many of those things are, shall we say, things that we grow through or grow out of and we accept and we understand. But there are fragments of the stories that we've been told that possibly lie within our unconscious mind. And what we want to do in this particular part of our journey is explore aspects of the story. And there are several bits to this that we can look at. The first bit is picking up from what Miguel Ruiz said in the Four Agreements, that we are surrounded by the agreements that we have made with other people during our upbringing, which are now unconscious. And rather cleverly, he said, why bother with trying to undo all of those old agreements unless they are causing us concern? Why don't we start to make new agreements? Why don't we start to tell ourselves new stories? And that's where we're at. If you've done the work on what makes you feel happy and you've done the work on your personal passion statement, then now you can start to work on telling yourself a brand new story. But let's look at how the old stories manifest themselves. Well, they manifest themselves in your language. There is a whole section in the workbook that goes with this, talking about how to unpick some of the language restrictions that you create for yourself and the language that actually defines, shall we say, the limiting belief systems that you hold. Words like should, must, and ought, they are known as command words. They're actually given the fancy name modal operators of necessity. But the question is, who's telling you you must? Who's telling you you should? Who's telling you you ought? Is it really your core self that's telling you that you must, you should, you ought? Or is it an instruction that you're carrying with you from when you were younger? Parents, teachers telling you that you ought to do this. Children should be seen and not heard. You should have done your homework by now. Come on, we did this last week. You should know this. Anybody who's got half a brain ought to know this. Those language patterns that we pick up on and respond to are buried deep within ourselves and our unconscious mind. And we need to look at the way that we respond to those patterns. Take the word I can't. Where does that come from? I can't do this. Now, true, physically you can't, maybe you can't do it. If you said to me, go and climb Mount Everest, I say I can't. But that's quite a demotivational full stop, isn't it, to an ambition? What if I tag the can't with yet? Well, I can't yet. That then supposes I can find what I need to bring to the table in order to achieve that task. Here's another bit of linguistic byplay for you. If you find yourself saying I can't, why don't you say it to yourself with I won't? I can't do that, I won't do that. It has a different tension, does it not? And the won't statement may be true to you. You're giving yourself the excuse you can't do it when you really don't want to do it. So start to be honest with yourself and your language. How to tackle these language patterns? When they crop up, notice them. When you say yourself, I should have done better, rephrase it. I could have done better if. I could have done better if what? I could have done better if I'd have only done. And now you're into actions. Remember, everything in this series is about taking action. You ought to. Well, who's saying you ought to? Are you telling yourself? And if you ought to, ask yourself, well, how do I do this thing I ought to do? The self-sabotage creeps in. when we actually have completed a task and we look at it and we think to ourselves, oh, I could have done better. Well, could have is possible. See, could have is not should have. So, how about when you look at something you've done, if you find yourself saying, I should have done better, that's the teacher, that's the parent, that's the side of you that is criticizing you, telling you off. If you say to yourself, well, I could have done better, how can you change that? Capture those language patterns, listen for them. And here's the crucial bit, listen for them in your self talk, not in what you say out loud, because maybe that's moderated. But when you say stuff in your head, when that voice inside your head says, come on, you should have known better, challenge it and ask it to say, well, what could I have done differently? Start to create solutions. Remember the presupposition I mentioned last time? That everything that you need to solve your problems is inherent in your own physiology. It's in you. It's in you. You can find these problems if you allow your creative mind to do that. Here's another one. What about the word because? Let's try a little experiment. I can't climb Mount Everest because I'm not fit enough. I'm not fit enough because, well, I didn't exercise when I was younger. I didn't exercise when I was younger because people laughed at me in the gym. Ooh, all of a sudden, those series of because statements have a deep underlying causality that maybe I've not recognized before. I can't apply for that job because I don't have the qualifications, because I crap at learning things. There's the belief system. But now, if you'd have stopped at the first because, you have some questions. Well, what do I need to get that job? Is this making sense? It's not rocket science, but it's the kind of stuff that we fool ourselves with. We tell ourselves stuff. We tell ourselves stories about who we are. And here's the point. You are the hero in your story. You're the author of your story too. And I don't know why sometimes we write ourselves some terribly awful stories that create scenarios which repeat themselves simply because we've not stopped to think about what could we do differently. As a therapist, I see people in repeating cycles of behavior, repeating cycles of relationships, repeating cycles of even abuse. Now, I'm not blaming people for those things. They are not responsible, as some authors might say in books like The Secret. You are not creating that yourself, but you are part of a series of patterns that allows you to accept that. There's a big difference between creating it and accepting it. And I think we need to look at the stories we've created so that we can challenge what we accept within our lives. And there's a big difference there. So if you are a could, maybe, possibly person, that's great, because I could do this if I had, and that moves it on. Possibly could do that when I can. These are movement statements. I should have done it. I must do it. I ought to do it. I'll stop dead statements because you've told yourself off. I won't do it. I can't do it. What's that old adage? Success comes in cans, not can'ts. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Never know how to put that one onto a poster because I don't know where the apostrophes go, but that's my problem. But I could challenge that problem by learning some good grammar or downloading a program on the internet that does it for me, if that makes sense. You have programs running around inside here that have created belief systems. What is a belief? What is a belief? A belief is a tabletop. The tabletop is the belief, what supports the table, the legs of the table. The legs of your belief are the experiences and evidence you have to support it. So if you're listening to this or watching this television program and you live in a European country or you live in America, it will apply in other parts of the world, but I'm just trying to outline, I may be being culturally specific here, so forgive me if I am. I don't mean to exclude you. But there is a belief that many children have grown up with in those parts of the world, in fact, worldwide, that have created perceptions and created responses and behaviours, and that belief was challenged and fell down overnight. What's the belief I'm talking about? Well, it's the belief in Father Christmas. Now, I'm sorry if you still believe in Father Christmas, but we're going to have a little chat about Father Christmas. If the belief in Father Christmas is the tabletop upon which you base other decisions, by the way, the legs for that belief have to be the fact that your presents arrived on the morning, that your parents told you there was such a thing as Father Christmas, that you actually wrote a letter to Father Christmas and it vanished, that you actually had your friends telling you it's Father Christmas, and in fact, maybe your teachers too. So your firm belief in Father Christmas is based on the firm legs upon which that tabletop rests, and you build other beliefs on it. Now let's have a look. Let's assume that our tabletop of the Father Christmas belief has four legs. It's easier to do with easier to deal with the four legs. Say one of those legs is what your parents tell you. Great. Say one of those legs is what your teachers tell you, because they're figures of authority when you're growing up, and therefore you believe in them. What your friends are very influential in what they tell you, so they tell you that Father Christmas exists, and there you go. And then the last bit of evidence that you have, the last table leg, if you like, is the fact that when you wake up Christmas morning, there's a half-eaten mince pie that you left for Santa, a half-drunk glass of whiskey or port or sherry, depending on what Father Christmas's tipple is, or what your father liked to drink, perhaps, and then a half-eaten carrot, which is what Rudolph had. And there may even be snow print footsteps to the hearthside where your presents are piled, and if you were in the household that I grew up in, there were reindeer droppings on the lawn. I've never worked that one out, but that's what they were. I have a firm set of evidence for my belief. And because people are telling me it stays there. Does that belief affect my perceptions? Sure it does. Because on Christmas Eve, every sound I hear in the house is translated into the frame of it's Father Christmas. So the floorboards creak, it's Father Christmas. There's a noise outside, it's the sleigh. And I maintain this perception and this belief about the reality of the world built around the Father Christmas myth as long as my parents keep it up. But then what happens? I go to school one day and my friends say, you know it's your parents, don't you? And one of those legs becomes shaky. I go to my teacher and say, is it true? And they say, yes, we have been involved in this global conspiracy. It's not Father Christmas, it's your parents. We apologise. As teachers, we'll never lie to you again. Yeah, right. And then you go back to your parents and say, is it true? And they want to maintain you in that sort of childhood phase, and they convince you and cajole you, and eventually you kind of suspect, but you keep going. Because why? There's a vested interest in keeping going, because we've been told that if we're naughty, Father Christmas will come. If we're naughty, he won't come. Get it right around. If he's nice, he will come. So our behaviour is influenced by that belief too. And when we start to doubt, we don't want to not get the present. So it's in our interest to keep the belief going, isn't it? Until one day our parents realise that they can't maintain the facade anymore, and they give us a catalogue to choose our presents from. And all of a sudden the Father Christmas myth collapses, the behaviours that went with that collapse, the perceptions that go with that collapse. Now, if you're of a certain disposition, like I am, my creative mind can recapture the belief in Father Christmas because I think it's fun. There's a romantic side of it, but I don't actually expect Father Christmas to solve all my problems. This is a belief. How many beliefs do you have that are actually supported by evidence that you want to be there that actually isn't? Because the circular nature of this is that the tabletop and the belief actually affects the way you interpret the evidence that comes in to your field. So a number of years ago, when I was teaching in a school, a young woman who I was working with had a very low self-esteem, very poor self-image, and she was rejecting work because she didn't like the idea of being criticised. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because criticism in an educational forum isn't criticism, it's feedback. But how many times do you hear feedback and take it as criticism because you have that I'm being told off belief? However, with this young woman, what I did was I said to her, look, I'll only mark the things that are right in your piece of work for the next month, so we can get used to you getting marks and feedback on what's right. And then I'll start to mark it properly as if for an exam. And she agreed, which is what we did. She gave me work in, I marked it, And what I noticed over the course of the month was her work got better because she was receiving positive affirmation on the work. When we decided to lift the rule of only marking positive and actually looking for the things that would be marked in an exam, I gave her a piece of work and I took it in, and believe me, this was a superb piece of work. There was very little I could falter on, just a few little grammatical things that previously would have been just one thing in a whole host of problems, but there's this one little thing. So when I gave her my honest feedback, I gave her the thing that she'd done well and then the one or two things she could improve on. She immediately ripped up the piece of paper and said I was lying to her. When I managed to unpick that, what she meant was that there were more mistakes that I had missed that she had noted. And she thought that I deliberately missed them, and I was lying to her because her perception was in critic mode all the time. So she was self-criticizing everything. Is this making sense? It's like when somebody who's a really good proofreader sees a piece of work, they get hung up on the spelling or the grammar and miss the intention of the words. Now, I'm not saying proofreaders are wrong in that. I'm saying that's the mindset they're working with. But does the proofreading take away the perception of the thing that is important or relevant in the message? How many stories do you tell yourself that get caught up in your own interpretation, which is based upon a story of you not being good enough, based upon a self-belief of you not being strong enough? Have a think about that for a moment. So we're back looking at the idea of stories, and the second bit that I'd like you to think about is what stories do you buy into that aren't yours but are society's stories, that are cultural stories? I'll give you an example. In the 1950s, it was assumed that no athlete could run a sub 4 minute mile. Then Roger Bannister managed to run in 3 minutes 58 seconds. He ran a mile. And as soon as he'd done that, other athletes within months started to beat that record because the limitation had been lifted. Now, in the ebook, you're going to read about a gentleman called Cliff Young. Cliff Young was an amazing gentleman. The story is that there is an ultramarathon that takes place in Australia that's between Sydney and Melbourne. I'm just looking down at the numbers here. I want to get this right. It's 543 miles and takes about 5 days to complete. Cliff Young turned up and said he wanted to run the race and wasn't allowed to initially because he appeared to be an old man in his overalls and his boots and seemed to be a bit of a joke. Because this ultra marathon attracts the best runners in the world, the ultra marathons, the elite. But there was this Cliff Young who wanted to enter it. And you'll read the story, but the story is that he entered it. And not only did he complete the race, in a new course record, he won the race. And it's since been discovered that the way he ran the race was the most economical, ergonomic way to run the race. The clothes he was wearing that was comfortable for him. And when he was asked what kind of rests he took in between the days of running, he said, "What? You mean I could take a rest?" He didn't know the rules, and because he didn't know the rules, he succeeded. Now, I'm not saying that you should go and start running an ultramarathon tomorrow. What I am saying is, what rules are you imposing on yourself that are actually nonsensical rules? They are other people's limiting beliefs about what you can do. Again, tackle them like you would tackle the tabletop. What's the evidence? And really look for the evidence of that belief. What was the evidence of Roger Bannister not being able to run a sub 4 minute mile? There wasn't any, just this belief that it couldn't happen. In the same way that when the railways first came to Great Britain, in the Industrial Revolution, when the little railway steam trains that eventually became so important in sort of global industrialization, but when they were developed by Robert Louis Stevenson in the UK, what was happening there was people thought that the trains couldn't go that fast or go very fast because people would suffocate because of the movement of the trains. And that wasn't true, but it was a limiting belief and a fearful belief. So really acknowledge and examine your belief systems. Have a think about it. And when you go through the booklet, have a look at the stories that are in there. And then please, we're not going to go into it here because we went into this on the television program, Joseph Campbell's cycle of the hero's journey. Each stage of the journey, from the current reality through the accepting of the call, the denial of the call, through that journey, through the hero's development, each step of that journey has a series of questions, and those questions are related to how you perceive yourself as the hero. And I think they are really worthwhile spending some time reflecting on them. They're in the ebook that goes with it. And very finally, not only are you the hero in your journey, but what heroes can you look up to get inspiration from? And again, in the ebook, there's an exercise about that. So please, please, as with the last session, work through the stories ebook and come back for the next bit, understanding more about the stories that used to limit you. Okay, thank you.